and share my screen. Right. Can you see that, Nigel? Or Steve?
Yeah, I can see that, Henry.
Okay. Just before I start, I want to make sure.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, we can see that.
All right, so yes, I'm going to talk about Colombia, which is not a country a lot of bird watchers have been to, although a growing number are starting to visit for reasons which will become clear, I hope. Why is it not moving on slide? I'll have to do it that way. Here we go. So Colombia, placed at the northwest end of South America. And it's got it lies in a really interesting location because it abuts Panama, coming down from Central America. So where Panama joins Colombia and then joins the Andes, you've got a huge mix of species. Colombia lies in the neotropics, or the New World tropics, and being a tropical region, it has incredibly high diversity. A lot of that's not just due to the tropical climate, but also the range of elevations available in Colombia, with mountains, volcanoes even stretching, I think up to 5,000 meters and beyond. I'm just going to give a brief history of Colombia. It's been inhabited since at least 10,000 BC in the Bogota area, which is the capital. The Spanish colonized relatively recently, only just over 500 years ago. And several hundred years later, Colombia gained independence. It's now home to a population of 50 million people, which sounds a lot, but it's a large country, so you can easily get away from the crowds if you wish. It's earned a reputation since the 40s for being out of bounds, really. Very few Westerners went. This was largely fueled by drug production and a guerrilla war with different factions trying to control the country. And this was led by a guerrilla group known as FARC, and a number of Westerners were kidnapped. But really the effect on the Westerners was minimal. It was the effect of the Colombian nationals was significant. Many thousands of people died during the war. And then it's relatively recently improved, only since 2005. The fighting was pushed into the deeper recesses of the country. But more than that, I think people, the guerrillas just lost the intensity for the war. And very recently, FARC disbanded, laying down their arms, and a peace deal was signed. So Colombia has transformed pretty much since the Second World War and is now a much safer place to go. This is the Foreign Office travel map for the country, and you can see most of it's green. There's some large areas still in orange where you shouldn't visit, but luckily most of the best birding areas are now in safe areas to visit, and indeed birding tours, and more often now independent travellers are going around the country and having trips that are fine, that pass without incident, but an awful lot of birds. So about our trip, we travelled for 3 weeks at the end of last year, 2019. It was a self-drive independent trip, so we just did our own thing using information gleaned off the internet and from trip reports other birders had done. But we did use local guides occasionally. In certain places, a local guide is mandatory, and in others it's recommended. But for the vast majority of the time, we just did our own thing. I should say I went with my partner, Sophie, who's on the call tonight. and a lot of her photos feature in this talk. So thanks for that. Our trip focused on the central and western Andes. I'll go on to talk about the sort of geography of the country in a moment. The central and western Andes are home to quite a lot of the country's endemic birds. So we focused our time there, and it's such a large country, you can't hope to see it all in such a short trip. But we also combined the main portion of our trip with a short visit to the Pacific coast over Christmas and a few days at the end of the trip in the Bogota area, the capital, which offers surprisingly good birding within day trip distance. So just a little bit about the geography of Colombia. I'm going to highlight the different regions just to briefly show you where they are. You may have heard of some of them, but in case these are new names. So you've got the Santa Marta Mountains in the north, which are not actually part of the Andes at all. They predate the Andes. We didn't visit this area during our trip, but a lot of birders do go there, and it's meant to be excellent birding with a lot of endemics. Then there's the Choco rainforest stretching down from Panama just into Ecuador. This is where we spent a bit of time on our trip and is home to a lot of Choco endemics. So these are birds that are only shared with either neighboring Ecuador or Panama. There's the Western Andes, so the first bit of relief as you move east from the Pacific coast. It's a narrow range of mountains, but pretty high, and it's high enough to stop a lot of species moving, so that in the valley, a little further to the east, the Cauca Valley, there's quite a few endemics that are just sort of stuck there and there's been no genetic flow for an awful long time. Then there's the Central Andes. I think this is the tallest range of mountains in Colombia, where most of the volcanoes lie. And then the large Magdalena Valley, so the lowlands stretching up from the Caribbean, almost to the Ecuador border. Quite a huge valley when you're driving through it. And finally, the Eastern Andes, the last sort of chain of the three chains of the Andes in Colombia. It's quite a broad range of mountains, and Bogota lies at the edge of it. And then a couple of areas we didn't visit at all on the trip, one for a future time, is the Amazon, home to a staggering array of species, and the Llanos, which is like a savanna habitat, home to a different set of species again. And again, not an area we managed to visit this trip. This was our route. We flew into Bogota and then took a small flight to Medellin, Colombia's second city. So most of the trip was spent in a relatively small part of the country. And here you can see Medellin. It was less than an hour's flight from Bogota, really not far at all. It sounds easy, but it wasn't. We ended up spending the first night of the trip on the airport floor because we'd missed a connection, and we missed the planes. So that put us off to a bit of a bad start straight away, but we caught up. Headline figures for Colombia before I go much further. It's one of the 17 megadiverse countries of the world. It's home to the most bird species of any country on Earth. So 1,958 species of birds when I put this talk together, but there's more species being found all the time, so I wouldn't be surprised if that figure's gone up. As I say, it's the highest country total in the world. And from that, there's 83 endemics, so quite a lot of endemic bird species you can only see in Colombia. In total, we recorded 603 species on this trip, so not even a third of the birds in Colombia, but still a lot of birds. And we recorded just over a quarter of the endemics to be found in Colombia. As you arrive, you are met in Bogota airport by lots of illustrations on the airport walls. It's a good omen for what's about to come. This is the Bogota rail, and one we very much hope to see during the trip. Having flown to Medellin and picked up our car hire, we went to Rio Claro, which is a private reserve along a river canyon, and is productive for some sort of subtropical species on the eastern side of the central Andes. Here's the lodge, and you can, looks after you very well, all your meals and board, and all the birding is done on foot from here with a couple of good trails. Whilst having your meals, though, you're likely to be accosted by red-tailed squirrels. This one was very friendly and even jumped on Sophie, tried to come birding with us during the afternoon. And here's the canyon at Rio Claro, and it's really steep, sort of cavernous canyon, but cloaked in thick forest and home to lots of birds, but they're quite hard to see. This was one of the first endemics we saw, the Magdalena antbird. As the name suggests, it's a species that's mostly found in the Magdalena Valley. The forest here was stunning and a really nice introduction to the birding in Colombia. Another of the endemics we saw was the beautiful woodpecker. This is found in a fairly small range of Colombia, so it's one we were pleased to see so early on in the trip. And another endemic, the sooty ant tanager. This is not my photo, I hasten to add, because they are very skulking and don't usually come out in the open like this. And after a couple of days walking the trails, we eventually bumped into this beautiful bird, the blue cotinga. Ours was sat on a fairly distant fruiting tree, which are always good places to look for cotingas in. But Rio Claro had one last surprise for us, and it was at this cave along the river. And we stayed here till dusk one evening when strange noises started coming out of the cave. And if you didn't know better, you'd think there were ghosts around, and it was all down to this bird, the oil bird. We saw them fly out of the cave after dusk, so you got these sort of silhouettes over the water. But we'd have to have actually climbed in the cave to see them this way. So then we moved on to a place over towards the eastern Andes, quite a drive. It doesn't look too far on the map, but the majority of the drive was off paved roads onto sort of dirt tracks. We've put our car to the test, really. This is what most of the drive looked like, and we really felt we were driving through the really remote parts of Colombia at this point, even only a few days into our trip. And it was fairly open country. It was sort of fields and things, but there were a few interesting sightings on the way, including this Venezuelan red howler monkey, which I didn't expect to see in farmland, but I think it might have just been moving through. We came to some wetland areas before we got to El Pojil, good for a number of herons and things. This is a snowy egret, similar to our little egret here in Europe. But one of the really good birds on this drive was the northern screamer. Has a fairly small range in northern Colombia, possibly just into Venezuela. But you really have to visit this part of the world to see this strange old bird. It's like a cross between a dinosaur and a turkey. It's got the loudest call. You can hear it from a mile away, screaming its head off. And then also striated herons, which are quite common, and we saw a number along the drive, but this one posed really nice for Sophie to photograph. Still at the wetlands, Amazon kingfisher. This is one of a few kingfisher species we saw on the trip, but this was quite a poser, so we stopped for far too many photographs of this one. And also the savannah hawk. This was a pair that were at their nest, and I suspect they were thinking about nesting if they didn't already have eggs, because they were sort of standing guard over this nest. And it was quite hot by this point, so we were using the car as a hide, and that way we got quite close to a lot of the birds on the drive. And some of the smaller birds included fork-tailed flycatchers. Now, this is part of a family, the largest bird family on Earth, the tyrant flycatchers. And this one's got an extraordinarily long tail. It's I think longer than the length of its body, so it's very distinctive flycatcher pattern, whereas most aren't particularly distinctive. And the Carib grackle, a bird that's spread from sort of the Caribbean shores of Colombia. As there's been clearance of habitat for farming, this bird's taken advantage of that and expanded its range in the country. And then after quite a few hours driving, we got to El Pojil. This is a lodge run by an NGO called ProAves, which undertake conservation in the country. And their model is to buy land, and at a number of sites, they put lodges there so birders and naturalists can visit. They generate income, and we see a lot of the wildlife, so it's a good deal, really. And we stayed in a lovely little wooden cabin on the banks of a river in the steamy tropical forests. And we were here for one bird in particular. This was a blue-billed curassow, and in this photo there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, at least 5 birds, but I think we had up to sort of 11, 12 birds here. This is a critically endangered species, and there's potentially as few as 250 left in the wild. So we were looking at a significant proportion of the world population just here. And thanks to it being a reserve, they're not hunted, which is one of the main threats, as well as habitat loss. And they actually come to grain and rice that's put out. This photo shows a male blue-billed curassow at the front, gorgeous bird, flanked either side by a couple of females, which have arguably even nicer patterning, the white dapples in the crest as well. It's just a fantastic bird, and it's so rare, so we were buzzing to see this straight after our arrival. There's a bit of a close-up of the female's crest. And thanks to the feeding, they've become rather tame. Here's Soph enjoying breakfast, and blue-billed curassows were just waltzing around the kitchen area. So we didn't have to work particularly hard for this rare endemic, but nice to see. Some of the other birds at El Pojil included grey-cowled woodrail, also coming out to feed on rice. And there's a couple of, I think there's one canopy tower there, and from the top there you can see some of the canopy species at close quarters, including this palm tanager. And then into the thicker woodland, down by the river, there was this, which is quite a localized bird in Colombia, the black ant shrike. And then it was time to leave El Pojil and move on to the next site. As this was a sort of a road trip of sorts, we never really stayed anywhere more than 1 or 2 nights, so it was quite fast-paced in that respect, but a good way to see lots of birds. And as we were leaving, the local guide there kindly agreed to show us this great potu. You might notice I put potus in brackets, and that's because there's 2 potus in this photo. There's a baby potu sitting under its mother, and if the mother wasn't well enough camouflaged, the baby's even better camouflaged. There's only an eye giving it away there. It was amazing to see. These birds eat moths and bugs on the wing, and they have huge mouths. You can just get a hint of the size of the mouth there, huge gape on it. So then we headed down to sort of down the Magdalena Valley and into the central Andes again, towards some of the highest mountains in the country. We stopped at a lovely little farm called Hacienda del Bosque, again, for one particular species. And on the way, we had our first encounter with peligro, or well, translates as danger, but we called these lorries peligros, and we ended up following them for most of the trip. They were very common, but they'd fly down the roads a heck of a speed, and at one point we thought one was just going to go over a crest and we'd see a ball of flames because it was just flying along. We thought it was going to crash. So it was always comforting to see one of the peligro lorries. And we made it to Hacienda del Bosque, where this is a fairly new venture where a farm has moved into ecotourism, and it's really on the rise in the country. It's nice to see. And they've discovered a particularly tricky and fairly rare bird on their property, which they've managed to show to people. You could tell I was quite excited here. It wasn't just the breakfast, it was mostly the thought of what we were about to see. So we wolfed down our breakfast and went out behind the farmhouse where there was some birds coming to seed, including this grey-browed brushfinch. But it was mostly hummingbirds here that stole our attention. This is the tourmaline sun angel. And hummingbirds have suitably bejeweled names, very befitting of their plumage. This is a buff-winged star frontlet, quite common at the sugar feeders. It looks even better in flight. You can see the buff wing patch there where the bird gets its name, but also a blue throat and a green forehead. It's hard to know what to call this. And then we saw the sword-billed hummingbird. This is famous in the bird world for, I'm pretty sure, being the only bird with a bill longer than its body. It's not a big bird, but the bill is enormous. And then when it sticks its tongue out, it looks even longer. Look at the length of that tongue. I'll just go back. There's the first shot, and there's the length of its tongue. And this is for feeding on plants like the nicotine flower with a really long tube. So it's very much a specialist, but has adapted quite well to artificial feeders. This is a female with the speckles underneath, but we saw a male here too, much darker green emerald underneath. So you might think, how does a bird like that preen? As most birds preen with their bills. Well, the sword-billed hummingbird has to preen with its feet. And you can see there one of its feet just giving its shoulder a scratch. It's a hard life being a sword-billed hummingbird. And also while we're there, the glossy flower piercers were pretty tame. You could put your hand right next to a feeder like this and they come and sit on your hand whilst they steal nectar from the feeder. These birds have hooked bills and they generally steal nectar from flowers, so they don't have to actually feed down the tube of a flower. Quite a clever adaptation. And then we got taken to the main event, really. We went through some farmland. It had a few birds, including this lovely patterned grey-breasted mountain toucan. Part of the toucan family, but there's only a few mountain toucans, so we were quite privileged to see this. And then we went to, we finally got to the ant pitter feeding stations, which is why we were here. Our guide, if I just go back a couple shots, our guide was down there at the bottom. And he took us to the feeders. You can't go to them without a guide, so and it's so that they can call in the ant pitters, which they literally have names for them. So they sort of sing the name and offer worms, and up pops, first of all, this rufous ant pitter, which has now been split actually. I'll have to check which species this refers to, this particular one. And another ant pitter feeding station, rather glamorous, this one, with a roof and everything. We saw the crescent-faced ant pitter. This was the reason we were here. It's one of the used to be considered one of the hardest ant pitters to catch up with in all the Andes. Wasn't known from too many sites and was very shy. So it's fantastic they've managed to tame a pair of these, and it's just a wonderful ant pitter with that huge crescent in front of its eye and the dark streaking down the belly. So we filled our boots with great views of the crescent-faced. They came to within a metre at times as they waited for worms. And they were eating so many worms that the local guide referred to them as gorda or fatty. They do look quite chubby in this photo, but I think very cute. So, as I say, we were up in fairly high terrain, and after visiting the farm, we went up even higher to the Nevado del Ruiz National Park, and behind there is is one of the tallest volcanoes in the country, of which we were birding the slopes of. I'm pretty sure it was dormant, but we didn't hear any rumbles while we were there anyway, so we just got on with the birding. It was fascinating landscapes. So these slopes were dominated by a plant called the espeletia. And these are ancient plants which grow very slowly, but they're absolutely huge. They're much taller than a person. And they produce flowers, which attracts a number of birds in this very cold, inhospitable landscape. So it's an important species. But we were here for one bird in particular that feeds on the espeletias, known in Colombia as the oxypogon. Better known to birders as the buffy helmet crest. And after quite a wait, this stunning bird came in and just sat there right in front of us. We couldn't believe it, so we were just busy taking photographs and trying to soak it all. And it's got this wonderful purple beard, but when it turns, you get an even brighter flash of colour, a sort of transition from purple through to orange into green. It's just a stunning bird. And another endemic, so a good one to see on the trip. So it's restricted to the central Andes. There's a few other species that it's been split from that are also found in separate mountain ranges. So I think this is one of the 4 helmet crests in existence now. Whilst we were up at high altitude, we saw the brown-backed chat tyrants. These are quirky little birds that like to perch up in the open, not hard to see at all. And by the roadsides and things, there were lots of seed eaters, including this Paramo seed eater. But while we were up on the mountains, we had one more site to visit. It was the Termales del Ruiz, which is a thermal sort of spa hotel. Not the most obvious place to go birding, but very nice surroundings. This is the thermal pool, which the hotel's named after, and we did go for a bit of a dip after the birding was done for the day. But they have excellent hummingbird feeders, and here's Sophie with a great sapphire wing on her hand. You might see they give you little sort of pots that you put sugar water in, and hummingbirds just lap it up. They come in and sit on your hand, and what a privilege to hold a hummingbird like that. And that's the great sapphire wing in all its glory. It's a large hummingbird, one of the larger hummingbirds in existence. And there's me with a buff-winged star frontlet. Again, you can see the buff patch in the wings, but I seem pretty transfixed on it at this point. And one of the other hummingbirds that visits this hotel, it's found fairly widely throughout the Andes at high altitudes, but I've never had views like this. This was stunning. This was the shining sunbeam, another name befitting the bird. And it looks pretty eye-catching at this angle, but when it turns away from you, you get a rainbow of colours from the rump and the back. Really amazing range of colours. And there was a golden-breasted puffleg there as well. And you can just see a hint of the of feathers on the leg, these sort of white boots. And then coming into fruit feeders were some of the tanagers. The tanagers are a completely fruit-eating family, from what I can remember. And the mountain tanagers tend to live higher up. They're a larger group of tanagers, but no less colourful and spectacular than the rest of the family. This is one of the more colourful members at higher altitudes. So we left the hotel and headed further south down the Cauca Valley, making a few stops at places. And we went up into the mountains one day to look for another rare endemic, the Fuertes parrot. But on the way we saw the crested caracara. This is a bird that fills a niche. It's a bit like a crow in Europe. They're sort of omnivores. They'll eat a bit of anything. They're quite large. They're bigger than a crow. There's a close-up of the beak. As we're heading uphill again, we saw another chat tyrant. This is the rufous-breasted chat tyrant. Really lovely little compact flycatcher. And you can just see a hint of the rufous on the breast there. But that's where the fun stopped. We hit problems. See Sophie here replacing the tyre. Shortly after, I looked under the car and we saw we'd made quite a bit of damage through going up this rough mountain track. And we were even unsure if we were going to be able to get off the mountain at one point. But we plodded on. We kept looking for birds, but we didn't see any in the end, and missed out on the Fuertes parrot. So we felt our day was summed up by the title of the biscuits that we were eating for our lunches. Posh. So it wasn't the best of days, but you have days like this in trips. Some go well, some don't, and we definitely had hit a bit of a bump in the road, so to speak. Well, literally. To rescue the day, we went down to the Jardín Botánico, or the botanical gardens of the city of Pereira. It's quite an urban place, but it protects a nice patch of forest, and we were shown around by a local guide for a while. But again, we had an endemic on our minds. And eventually we went to a tree right by the sort of area where all the students were hanging out. It's a university district, and up pops this fairly localized endemic. We couldn't believe it. So that rescued the day somewhat. And then we headed to the most southerly extent of our main part of the trip, Otunquimbaya. We're looking forward to this site as it's a former, I think, coffee plantation, but also tree plantation, but it's been restored, and there's a lot of natural forest there, including it's home to some of the hardest endemics in the country. On the way in, we saw southern lapwings. These are quite widespread birds, and a bit like the grackle earlier on, these have done well thanks to sort of clearance of land. And another common roadside bird is the roadside hawk. They're very well named because that's the sort of main place you see them. You're unlikely to go for a drive of a couple of hours and not see one. And this was the main building at Otunquimbaya that welcomed us, and it was a relief to get there after the day we'd had. But we knew we had a few days ahead here to settle in and enjoy the birding. Most of the birding, just to say, we also got our dose of vitamin N, or vitamin nature. The Colombians were very aware of the value of nature for our health and well-being, and it was nice to see. Most of our birding was done along the entrance road, so very simply, just walking up and down the entrance road. But as it is quite often in neotropical forests, you might not see anything for a little while, and then you'll hit a flock and there'll be birds all around. But there's one particular bird we put a lot of time in to look for, and that involves setting off at some ungodly hour, about 3 o'clock in the morning, a couple of mornings in a row, walking 7 or 8 kilometres in the dark along this track, just hoping not to bump into any pumas or anything. But we did it for one particular bird, and on the second morning of trying, we finally got it. It was the hooded antpitter. This is a bird that was pretty mythical until recently. It just wasn't known in real life, and slowly its call was learned, and then it's been picked up at a few more sites. But there's potentially only 4 sites it's known from in the world at present, and this is one of the most accessible. So we were over the moon to see this bird. I borrowed this photo off the internet because our views were not as superior as this, but it was just great to see it. And we had an obligatory celebratory photo following that. So as I say, most of the birding was along this road, and it was such lush tropical forest, and we kept hitting so many flocks of birds, it was never dull. I was expecting longer periods without seeing things, but we ended up going from one flock pretty much to another. The forest was home to a lot of birds, including, oh, well, first I'm just going to talk about the bryophytes and epiphytes that grow on the trees. These wonderful bromeliads were all over the place, even on tiny branches. There was barely a square inch of bark visible on some of these trees. And they were even colonizing the roofs. This little shed was rapidly becoming part of the forest, covered in bromeliads and mosses and ferns. But one of the starbirds we saw in the forest itself was the Andean cock of the rock, a bird that is archetypally South American, found in the Andes only. I've also seen it in Ecuador, but I think it stretches down into Peru, and it's a classic bird of South America. We were actually quite lucky to see this one because it's not common at this site. What is more common, but just as nice to see, was the red-ruffed fruit crow. It's one I've looked for in several other South American countries without success. This is a very large member of the cotinga family, similar to the blue cotinga earlier on in the talk. This is a very small, well, patchy distribution. It's actually found in quite a few parts of South America, but nowhere apart from here is it particularly common. And Blackburnian warbler. This is one that would get the pulse raising of anyone birding on the west coast of Britain in autumn. It's a real bright warbler, and thankfully there were quite a few wintering in Colombia, so we got to enjoy these on a daily basis. And another of the endemics was the chestnut wood quail. So we spotted a little party of these. These are like partridges, really, and they live in the forest. And you just have to be lucky with these. This species wasn't coming into feeders anywhere along our route, so we got lucky and saw a few pottering through the forest floor. Another of the endemics, this site was home to so many endemics. This is the Cauca guan, a real sort of game bird that away from Otum Kimbaya is very rarely found. So this is one of the main sites for the species now. If what had gone before wasn't bright enough, you've got the multicoloured tanager. And this is quite a tricky bird to see, and we didn't get as good a views as this, but I thought I'd put a real top-notch photo in just to show off what the tanagers can look like. This is an endemic tanager, mostly found in the sort of central and western Andes, and it just blew our eyes out. We had one more bird to see here before we left, the Pato de Torrente, and a bit better known as the torrent duck. And we'd checked quite a few river sites for this species without success. Always has to be a torrent, a real fast flow of water and boulders for the ducks to grip onto. And how they held on to these slippy rocks with the amount of water flowing over them, I do not know. They must just have really strong claws on the end of their webbed feet. Whilst we were at the river, another bird with torrent in the name, the torrent taranulette, a little flycatcher that was hopping up and coming back to the same rock as it fed on flies. Nice to watch. And that was Otunkimbaya, some of the best birding we'd had on the trip so far. A real nice selection of endemics, but also just the general birding was constant and had made up for any misses in the pre-trip. Somewhere then that birders always go to when they're in Colombia is Rio Blanco. This is near the city of Manizales, up in the hills above, and it's a protected reserve because it is part of a watershed that a water company own, and they've seen the value of protecting rainforests for helping create that resource that is their business, water. So thankfully they protect quite a large area of forest here, and they've set up a lodge. On the drive up, we noted all the, you might call it graffiti, but more like street art really. It was better than sort of some of the graffiti we see. Really nice artwork, and this was quite frequent sight in Colombia. They really have adopted a lot of nature into their sort of culture. And it's there for everyone to see and enjoy. Even better sort of piece of a mural was this one we just found next to some roadworks. Can you imagine that in the UK? It had mountain toucans, tanagers, all sorts. So this is the lodge at Rio Blanco. The old lodge on the right and a new one on the left that we were fortunate to stay in. I think it had very recently opened and was just a lovely place to stay on the slopes of the hillside. Very comfortable indeed. But we weren't here to sleep, we were here to go birding. And first up was this Andean pygmy owl. Now, we were shown this by our local guide. This is one of the sites you have to have a local guide at. But we're thankful we had him because he had very good ears and eyes. And he picked this bird up very quickly after setting off on our walk. And it was only the 4th record for the reserve, so very lucky to see that. And then, not too long afterwards, one of the star birds at the reserve popped up. Couldn't believe it. This is the masked saltator. And the saltators are quite a large family, large-sized family of birds, a bit bigger than your average tanager. But this one's was thought extinct for quite a few years, and then it's been found at only a few sites in the Andes. Rio Blanco is thankfully one of the most reliable sites in the world to see this bird, so we're very lucky because not everyone who visits there sees this. And then birding along the track, we had flame-rumped tanager, a common bird, but really stunning. Look at the rump on that. And then when we got into forest, we started getting a few interesting species. This is the rufous-crowned toady flycatcher. Pretty colourful for a flycatcher, really, and very hard to see until it actually stopped and sat there for a moment. This is the rufous-collared sparrow, which anyone who's birded in South America will have probably seen. It's very widespread and probably one of the most abundant birds, but actually, saying that, it's still a very pretty little thing with that stripy face pattern and that rufous collar. In the forest itself, we got great views of a couple of toucan species. The first was black-billed mountain toucan. That was to add to one of the mountain toucans we'd seen a few days before. And also the southern emerald toucanet. So quite a hard bird to see. As you can see, the feathers blend into the background of leaves. And until this bird moves, hops or flies, it can hide there in full view. And I presume I walked past dozens of these, but we did eventually see one, and this one showed quite nicely. And again, the reason we have to have a guide at Rio Blanco is because there's a number of antpitter feeding stations, and our guide here was Daniel, and we spent a few days birding with him here. And he was fantastic. He knew the birds inside out, but he lived on the site, so they were his garden birds in effect, and it was great to have that local knowledge. Here he is putting out some worms for a number of the antpitter species that are found here. Away from these feeding stations, antpitters are almost impossible to see. So with the development of these feeding stations, it's really revolutionized the antpitter chances. You can even feed them yourself. Here's Sophie with a worm in her hand, feeding a brown-breasted antpitter. There it is taking it out of the hand. Oh, brown-banded antpitter, apologies. This is an endemic to Colombia, one that's thankfully common at Rio Blanco, but elsewhere is very restricted. So one of the stars of the show here. Also was bicoloured antpitter. Quite a striking grey belly on that one. And although quite common throughout the Andes, the chestnut-crowned antpitter's got to be one of the more smart-looking antpitters with those lovely markings on the flanks and the chestnut cap. This one came bounding in, was like demanding its worms before they'd even been put out. They've trained them well. Showed superbly. And the last antpitter, smallest but by no means the least, was the slate-crowned antpitter. This took a bit more work, but we'd walked away and we're about to move on and sort of draw a line under missing this species, and then Daniel just had one last look and it was there, waiting. So that was nice to see. And we retreated back to the lodge for our lunches. We tended to make our own lunches. You know, it was a pretty solid field lunch of ham, cheese and biscuits, and that kept us going for several weeks. And we generally have a nicer meal in the evening when we had a bit more time. These were good if we were in a hurry. I mean, in the background here, there were hummingbirds galore. We didn't have a lot of time for eating. And just to show you what the forests were like at Rio Blanco, there's some farmland in the foreground, but the forest just stretched to the horizon, and they were really well cloaked in forests. But also from up here you can see down into the city of Manizales, one of the bigger cities in this region. We weren't done birding here just yet. There were several trails through the forest. We went along here looking for flocks and things, and quite a regular visitor was this rufous-breasted flycatcher. But then we struck gold. We'd seen some hummingbird activity, and they looked like they were mobbing something. So we stuck around and walked around and viewed from various angles, and Sophie laid eyes on this amazing Stygian owl. It's kind of like a really dark version of a long-eared owl, and although it's found throughout much of Central and South America, it's not an easy one to catch up with, so we were very lucky to see this. I watched it for quite a while. A bit hidden in the vines and things, but we got good looks at it, and eventually the hummingbirds gave up mobbing it, realised it wasn't a threat as it was roosting, and the owl could rest peacefully again. Also along the trails were masked trogons, part of quite a large family of birds that change usually depending on what elevation you're in. This is one of the higher altitude trogons. And we also did well to see a tyra. This is a large mustelid, much bigger than a stoat, sort of badger-sized, but it makes sometimes makes a bit of a racket when you're walking through a forest, but you might never actually see it. So we were quite surprised to see this one out in the road in broad daylight. It just looked at us for ages. I think they've got pretty bad eyesight, but good sense of smell. And then at hummingbird feeders, there was another nice set of birds. This is the collared Inca. and the astonishing long-tailed sylph, another bird where the tail seems to be as long as the body, if not longer, and it has these lovely emerald and turquoise sheens to it. And there was also the buff-tailed coronet here showing off its buff tail. It wasn't all hummingbirds. There was great thrush. These are quite common in the higher parts of the Andes. And the blue-winged mountain tanager. Look at the colours on that, that's just amazing. And these came into fruit feeders, so a lot of the lodges have cottoned on to the fact that having sugar and fruit feeders out is a good way to attract the birds in. We did see these birds occasionally in the forest, but never showed as well as this. And another migrant down in Colombia for the winter, the scarlet tanager, was also coming into the fruit feeders. Its fruit of choice, I think, was banana, which you can just see to the right. So, starting to head back up to Medellin, we called in at a number of sites, but one was the Yellow-Eared Parrot Reserve, another site that's owned and run by Pro Aves, which they protect for this parrot. This is another bird that was feared extinct for a long time until populations were rediscovered here and at one or two other sites. They're still endangered, but we know what they require for their breeding, so they're helping with their conservation now. On the way up, we called through a lovely little Colombian town called Jardín, which translates as garden. But it was one of the best little Colombian towns. We saw lovely sort of hints of Spanish architecture there and really bright colours. A reflection of the sort of natural heritage of the country as much as anything. And above the town was some forest, which is home to the yellow-eared parrot. These steep hillsides just cloaked in steamy forests. And then finally we got up there. It was a pretty rough road again, but our car made it. We were really flogging it at this point, just hoping we'd get the car through all the sites we had planned, really. But we started to see some good birds. This is the golden-fronted white start, a near endemic, but a nice one. And then eventually we had some yellow-eared parrots. They were always quite distant, so this is a picture I borrowed, but it illustrates the species lovely, and it's another good Colombian endemic. And this photo shows one of the main things the species needs for its conservation, these tall wax palms. It needs the old ones with rotten holes in it that woodpeckers create. They sort of enlarge and then they can nest in them. But because of a demand for things like heart of palm, which is something people harvest from palms that they eat out in South America, these palms were being felled and for the food, and that's taking away the nesting habitat. So by protecting the palms, you protect the bird, and they are slowly recovering in numbers and range. And then from the Yellow-Eared Parrot Reserve, we continued northwest. This was as furthest west we headed on the main part of the trip, up into the Western Andes. And over here, we're at the edge of the Choco biome, which is this forest that continues from the Western Andes right down to the Pacific coast, pretty much uninterrupted. It's one of the best preserved forests in the country, and unfortunately, it only has that to. It can only be put down to the sort of civil war and the danger of the area, that the forest is still there because people just didn't venture in to clear the forest. Now, some parts of this region are still too dangerous to visit. There's still a few people, few angry people hiding out. So this is as far west as we went. Not many birders continue further west, to be honest, and our government doesn't advise you do. So, but Las Tangas is a safe place where most birders go now, because it's at a nice altitude for lots of good birds. On the way, though, we had to pass one or two of these landslides after the torrential rains that the region gets. They can get up to 12 meters of rain a year. It's one of the wettest parts of the world. It just washes away whole hillsides. So trying to put a road across it seems a bit crazy, but wouldn't be able to access the forest if there wasn't a road. So we carefully went through these landslide areas very slowly. And we eventually made it. And this was a brief lull in the weather. The Choco was living up to its reputation of being pretty wet during a lot of our visit there. But the birds seemed to be used to it, and we saw a lot of good birds. This is the welcome sign. As you can see, it's had funding from the American Bird Conservancy, so it's a protected reserve. And one of the first good birds we saw here was the red-bellied grackle. This is a pair of them, and it's an endemic bird that's only found here and in parts of the Cauca Valley below, quite a small range, so a good endemic to see. But this pair were doing a bit of preening of each other, cementing their pair bond, and I thought this was quite funny, so included this because they barely got a moment alone. They were just being hounded by their offspring who wanted attention or food. You could just see the look in their eyes. The parents looked exasperated. Early morning, though, at Las Tangas, the views were stunning. These sort of valleys were filled with fog and cloud and just little hints of what lay beyond poking through the fog. Eventually, the fog lifted, revealing endless forest. It's just a joy to be in habitat like this. We got on with the birding. In slightly open country, just before we got into the forest proper, we had this white-headed wren. And then there's a nice trail at Las Tangas, which runs for a couple of kilometers, and conveniently they've put a few shelters along the way. So if it rains, you can take shelter and stay dry whilst you continue to look for birds. One of the more regular fixtures here was the ornate flycatcher and also three-stripe warbler. These two were in a lot of the flocks or just alone at times. The scaly-throated foliage gleaner was another bird that we saw here, quite a nice sort of orange brow on that, quite distinctive. This is part of a family called the ovenbirds or furnerids, largely brown things, but this is one of the more distinctive members. And then a really cool bird, the brown-billed scythebill. And it was quite foggy at this point, so I didn't get a great photo, but I just thought it was such a distinctive bird with that down-curved beak that a silhouette alone sort of shows off its most distinctive feature. And then a good Choco endemic or two came after that. This is the black solitaire, so a bird that's only found in these Choco forests. And the olivaceous peaha. This is a nice fruit-eating bird that came in really close, just quite out of the blue, but sat there for a moment to get a photo before it flew off. And the indigo flower piercer really is quite a vivid blue, and was having fun trying to extract the nectar out of these small flowers. And another good one was the fulvous dotted tree runner. This is one we had to wait till nearly the end of our visit to see, but it's one I'd missed in Ecuador, so I was pleased to see it here. And you can't forget the tanagers. The tanagers in the Choco are some of the brightest anywhere, headlined by this glistening green tanager. And also the purplish mantled tanager. Just a lovely palette of colours on that. Not so bright, but far more rare is the Choco vireo. This is one that we had hoped to see, and we didn't get particularly good views, but I scoured the internet for a photo because I didn't manage any, and there's not many good photos on the internet as a whole. This was only discovered new to science, I think, back in the 90s, so it's not a very well understood species. But we were coming up to Christmas time, and we stayed back in a nearby village and took in the lights. I think it's fair to say they do Christmas in Colombia better than us. Look at the lights out on display there. And then we finished our time at Las Tangaras and started to head back to Medellin, where we finished the main part of the trip. This sort of photo typifies a lot of the landscape in Colombia. There was sort of low-level farming, quite a lot of clearance, but some of the steeper valleys still had forest in them. As we drove back to Medellin, the forest got drier. We dropped down into the Cauca Valley. It's another region that has a number of endemic birds, and this is one of them. I think this was only found and described back in about 2010, so fairly new to science, the Antioquia wren. And this is named after the region it's found in, Antioquia. So we're pleased to see that. And that was it for the main part of our trip. As you can see here, we'd put the car through its paces. There'd been a few days of wet weather and mud had flown everywhere, but it got us there. And I would say that some of the roads we took on were a bit foolish, despite having an SUV, but we did make it. So, yeah. Then we took a flight down to the Pacific coast. It was coming up to Christmas, so we fancied a few days by the sea. Bit of sea, sand, but also some interesting birds. So we flew to a little town called Bahia Solano, and then we took a little tuk-tuk to El Valle, which is situated right on the seafront. The only way to get to this region is by flying. You have to take a small internal flight, and again, because the region is one of the wettest in the world, flights frequently don't go, and we ended up losing a whole day of the trip, waiting in an airport. Will it go, won't it go? We waited all day. We got on the flight and flew there. We were just about to land at Bahia Solano 40 minutes later, and they decided it was too dangerous to land, so we flew all the way back to Medellin, and that was a whole day gone. So not the best part of the trip, but typical of some of the travel conditions that everyone faces in Colombia. Even the bird tours get days lost to travel impairments. So we stayed in Medellin one more night and then got the plane the following morning, and thankfully it went. This is a view of Medellin from above. The city, interestingly, back in the 80s was considered the most dangerous city on earth, largely because of the fighting drug cartels, trying to fight for territory and things. And it's just remarkable how far the city's gone. We felt completely safe most of the time in this city. There's a few dodgy areas still, but that's pretty much like any city. And it's actually won awards now for how far it's come and how far they've reduced poverty. Shortly after leaving Medellin, we flew over the Choco forest down to the Pacific, and even from this altitude, it was just forest as far as the eye could see. I do very much hope this forest stays protected. We finally made it to our little hostel for a few days over Christmas, the Hakuna Matata hostel. And it was basic, but situated between the edge of the forest and the sea, so it's perfect. A nice place to spend a bit of time in a hammock. And our cabin, just at the edge of the forest. We tried not to be distracted by the sea too much, but we did eventually wander down and take it in and have a bit of a relax. We had been going for over 2 weeks by this point, pretty much solidly, so it was time for a bit of a rest. And a nice place to do it in. But we did go birding a couple of the days we were there, and we were joined by a local guide called Barmes. He used to be a hunter, but he has changed. He's changed his ways, and he's now a bird guide. And he has got some of the best ears on a birder I've ever known. He just knows where the bird is and minutes before we see it. He's just got this intuition, which probably only came from his history as a hunter. So we took a boat along the coast from El Valle to one of the least visited national parks in Colombia, the Utria National Park. And much of the boat ride, it took about an hour to get there. Much of the boat ride, you just got forest coming down to the sea. It was nice, really nice to see. And we were joined by magnificent frigate birds, quite a typical bird of tropical seas. They just come in and check you out, see if there's any food being thrown out, and then they move on. And then we approached Utria National Park, we rounded a headland, and we finally docked. And we were the only people there. We had a whole national park to ourselves. And it was quite well set up for birding. There's a nice trail through the mangroves, and here there are a few specialist species in this particular habitat. This is the first, the Humboldt sapphire. Quite a small range on it. There's very few birders who've seen this species, so we were pleased to see it in the mangroves, but we had to check through a lot of blue-chested hummingbirds in order to see this. But whilst we were looking, though, Barmes had heard this particular hummingbird calling in advance and knew it was around, so was his impressive hearing. A few of the birds in the mangroves were this bright-rumped Attila. This is a flycatcher, but it's got a hooked bill and eats quite large insects. And one of the ones I really wanted to see was this brown wood rail. You could just see its beak there and its red eye, but it always stayed slightly hidden behind the roots of the mangroves. Very well camouflaged. And I'd missed this one in Ecuador, so I was really pleased to catch up with it in Colombia. And it's a bird that's really struggled in Ecuador with habitat clearance. So I was really pleased to see that there was a number of them here. It wasn't all birds. We got distracted by dragonflies, including this impressive emerald-coloured dragonfly. I don't know what species, but maybe a drop wing of something. And also in the mangroves, a black-breasted puffbird, and this was devouring a katydid, this insect that it had found. It whacked it against the branch. We watched it for ages doing this. It was quite gruesome, but also fun to see. And then we were seeing different choco endemics to those up at Las Tangras a little earlier in the trip, now that we were in the lowlands. And this is one of them, the choco toucan, distinguished by its black and yellow beak. And the more wide-ranging golden hooded tanager, but again, another tanager with a smart pattern. So it got pretty hot in the daytime. We had a couple of hours downtime just to sit out the heat, really. It was too hot to go walking. You just get overheated. But eventually, a bit later in the afternoon, we took our boat over to the other side of the bay, walked a trail where we saw this bird, the sapayoa. This is a bird that gets a lot of people excited because it's quite a rare sort of species found in these Pacific forests. It does get into Panama and just into Ecuador as well, but it's not an easy species to see anywhere. And it's a confusing bird. It's in its own monotypic genus, so it's not really still known what it's related to, but it does eat fruits. And shortly after it did this rather, well, it looks like it's calling, but it regurgitated a stone from a fruit. And there's a closer shot, and you can just see a little yellow crown poking out. It's not the best looking bird in South America, but it's notable for its uniqueness. So it'd been a good day with Barmes and on our boat driver, and this is us celebrating on the way back to our hostel. And the next day was Christmas Day, but we didn't rest. We went out birding. We actually set off at about 2 a.m. To go and walk this trail. We only had a few days down the Pacific, so we wanted to make the most of it. We walked the trail that goes to the Utria National Park. We didn't quite get as far as the national park, but there was still good forest along the way, and we were seeing birds like great green macaws and lots of other parrots in particular. This is one of the features we saw. You might see these long pendulous nests. These are the nests that it builds, the chestnut-headed oropendula. Called oropendula, if you know your Spanish, oro, gold, and pendula, tail. So it's chestnut-headed golden tail, effectively. And we were searching through all these chestnut-headed oropendulas for its rarer cousin. But it wasn't easy going. We'd been searching for hours, and I was not doing too well at this point. We were getting bitten to death by mosquitoes. And so, yeah, not my finest moment. So thanks to Soph for capturing that. But eventually we got it, the Baudo oropendula. This is a rare choco endemic that very few birders have seen, and was our primary reason for visiting these forests. It's got a very distinct pink patch around the face here, but again, like the rest of the family, it's got the golden tail you'd expect. So after that, and after Christmas, we flew back to Medellin. We had a couple of days here before the end of our trip. And so we popped up to a place called Vereda Cerrales. And this was a site that's fairly recently appeared on the birding map for one bird in particular. This bird, the Antioquia brushfinch. And this had only fairly recently been described new to science. It had been lying in a drawer for many years, and then researchers discovered it and identified it as similar to the slaty brushfinch, but different enough to warrant its own species status. So this had only been rediscovered a year before we went out to Colombia, and we got in touch with the person who found it. Nice chap called Rodolfo, and he agreed we could go to his farm where the bird lives on private land, so we were shown some of the better sites to see the bird, and this is one of them. This is sort of typical of this landscape, a lot of farmland with habitat that's been cleared, and is thought to actually be the reason this bird is so rare, because of the limitations in the amount of habitat. There's a lot of clearance gone on, but some of the steepest valleys and slopes still have decent woodland cover. First up, though, was this yellow-breasted brushfinch, which was close, but not quite what we were after. And then after about 2 hours, we eventually saw an Antioquia brushfinch. So we were made up to see this. This is a critically endangered bird, potentially only 40 in the world. It's likely that a few more will get discovered now their call is known and now their habitat preference is known. But certainly one of the rarest birds I've ever seen. And again, not a lot of birders have seen this. So there's these kind of exciting, fairly recently described birds to go searching for in Colombia. Here's Rodolfo on the right, and part of the conservation initiative to help the species, and it's largely about educating the farmers to leave some habitat for the birds, and that can bring in other forms of income such as ecotourism income, so that the forest has a value. And following our visit, we were asked to write an article for the Neotropical Bird Club. So we actually wrote an article on seeing the critically endangered Antioquia brushfinch. So if anyone would like a copy of that, please get in touch after the talk, and I can send you a PDF for this if you're interested. As we had a day or two left, we spent a bit of time in Medellin seeing a few birds around our hotel, including this cool lineated woodpecker. Classic sort of Woody the Woodpecker type pattern on it. And the endemics still kept coming. Even in our hotel garden, we saw a Colombian chachalaca, another game bird. And here's Sophie at La Romera. We popped up there as a nice sort of afternoon away from the hotel to look for a particular species. That's it on the edge of Medellin. And it took us seconds, luckily, to see this bird, the yellow-headed manakin, and then it went missing. We didn't see it again, so we were very lucky to get this view. This is pretty range restricted. There's not many sites you can see this bird. So that was our time in the centre and west of the country. We were flying out of Bogota a few days later, so we had to get an internal flight over to Bogota, down there in the bottom right of the picture. But with a couple of days to spare, we did a little bit more birding and went up to a park called Chicaque, where there's some lovely forest, but we were here for one bird in particular, like so many other sites on this trip. It wasn't this one, but these showed nicely. This is the ashy-throated Chlorospingus, related to tanagers. And here's a fine tanager. This is the grass-green tanager. Sophie nearly killed herself trying to see this one. She fell off the rock, but we held on to each other, we didn't die, and we saw a grass-green tanager, so that was good. But this was why we were here, the golden-bellied star frontlet, and it was visiting feeders, but this male only came in once, very briefly. We didn't see it for long. There were a couple of females about as well. Lovely pattern on that one. And another national park on the boundary of Bogota. There's some wonderful places to go for day trips from the capital. This goes to very high altitudes where there's a different set of birds once again. And this is one of the better birds we saw in terms of its rarity. This is the rufous-browed conebill, another Colombian endemic. So a good one to see so late in the trip. And the slaty bushfinch. This is a bird that's much more common than the Antioquia bushfinch that we'd seen just a couple of days before, but rather similar looking. And then, whilst we're still up in the hills of Bogota, there's a place that birders just have to go to if you're visiting. It's called Observatorio de Colibris, or the Hummingbird Observatory. And it's a lovely little garden just full of hummingbird feeders. There's probably 20, 30 hummingbird feeders up here. And it's a tourist attraction, not just birders, but the general public visit this place. Such is the views that could be had of these wonderful hummingbirds. This is the black-tailed train bearer. Definitely got a tail longer than its body, this one. Probably twice as long, if not more. Just phenomenal. And then, not particularly big, but a lot more colourful, is the glowing puffleg. If you caught the light just right at the right angle, the whole bird would light up. And you've got these sort of purplish blue undertail, the huge white boots, the emerald belly, and the blue throat. It's got everything going on here. And another, I think this one's near endemic, the blue-throated star frontlet. This particular garden is one of the best places to see this bird. So another really good species to see so close to the capital. But because the tourists visit, and quite a few birders, they've got a shop, and it's one of the best shops I've ever seen. It's just full to the rafters of hummingbird memorabilia. Sophie had a really good time looking around this, and I did too. And then we finished. This was the final stop of the trip at a place on the boundary of the city. You can see the skyscrapers in the distance. This is called Parque La Florida, and it's a wetland habitat. And it being near to the city, it does suffer from things like pollution and disturbance from stray dogs. But there's quite a lot of birds here, and they're quite tame. So This was a flock of barefaced ibises in with some cattle egrets there. They were all flushed up by some dogs. And an American coot, which only just gets down into this part of South America, different to the American coots further north that have an all-white bill like our coot, well, nearly all-white bill. But this subspecies has yellow on the bill, so quite distinctive, and may be due a split eventually. We saw a good bird here. In terms of rarity, this was a large-billed tern, which we weren't expecting at all. It was only something like the third or fourth record for the site. I actually thought it might be a plastic model for a while. It didn't move, but eventually it took off, and we're pleased to see that. A yellow-hooded blackbird. These were forming sort of small flocks. They're not like the blackbirds we see. They're not thrushes, so to speak. They're part of the Icterid family, which is found throughout the New World. And then last bird of the trip, the Bogota rail. And just as we'd started the trip seeing Bogota rail on the walls of Bogota Airport, we finished the trip by actually seeing one. And it was being flanked with guinea pigs and all sorts of things around the marshes here, but this is quite a range-restricted endemic, so really, really nice to finish the trip with this one. And that's it. That's a whirlwind tour of central and western Colombia. So I hope you enjoy the talk. But first, I'd just like to, before I take questions and things, I'd just like to show you a video that Sophie made of some of the highlights in video format. It's only a short video. Just share my screen again. Hopefully the show's okay for you. And that is everything. So I'll just stop recording.